As we continue our awards show for end of the year, we're now recapping some of the best and worst CPU launches for the year. The categories include Best Overall Value, Most Well-Rounded, Best Hobbyist Production CPU, Best Budget Gaming, Most Fun to Overclock, and Biggest Disappointment. We'll be walking through a year of testing data and reviews as we recap some of the most memorable products leading into Black Friday and holiday sales. As always, links to the products are provided below in the description, alongside our article for a written recap. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Gigabyte AMD RX 580 and RX 570 mid-range video cards. Gigabyte's Aorus RX 570 now starts at $150 US on some retailers, offering an affordable gaming solution for high settings and 1080p. These cards now come with your choice of games, picked between Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry 5, and The Division 2. You can pick 2 of 3. Learn more at the link in the description below. So, as a reminder here, data isn't the focus for today. We're recapping coverage, so we're pulling charts from about a year's worth of testing and reviews here. And from those older pieces, I need to stop doing that. Thank you to the reader who sent in the CPU fidget spinner. From those older pieces, you'll have to keep in mind that, of course, Windows updates, hardware changes, things like that impact performance results. So for the most up-to-date CPU benchmarks, you'll want to check our newest CPU review. That's either going to be the 9600K or 9980XE review at time of this going live, and that'll have the most updated numbers for you. But we're still going to be showing some of the older charts just for perspective on how things have changed, because a year is a really long time in the world of Microsoft Windows updates, where it updates seemingly every 15 minutes at this point. We'll also be mailing out GN Award crystals to the companies for their most important products for the year that are featured in here. So Intel and AMD will each get one for different reasons. The award crystal is a 3D laser engraved GN teardown logo with extreme attention to detail, and although the products have to earn the award, you can buy one for yourself at store.gamersnexus.net. The award for Best Overall Value goes to AMD's R5 2600 this year, which receives the award for its new $160 price point and high marks performance in both gaming and lightweight production workloads. As a reminder, it wasn't long ago that we were buying i3 CPUs in the 6th and 7th gen for about $160, which were always tough to justify against the then incumbent Intel i5s at around $180 to $200. Although threads aren't everything, the higher thread count R5 2600 and its reasonable overclock frequencies do establish the product as a lightweight champion with versatility for gaming and some production tasks. Over the past year, we've tested the R5 2600 in streaming while gaming simultaneously and have found it to perform reasonably well with faster H.264 encode settings. We've also tested it for Blender workloads, where an overclocked 2600, effectively a 2600X, except a bit better, to 4.2 GHz ranks nearing last generation's R7 1700 at stock settings. We've tested the CPU in gaming, where it can keep up admirably, shown in several of our charts from the recent 9600K review, and we'll flash through a few of those on the screen now in case you've missed our recent benchmarks. The R5 2600 isn't the best CPU in any one category, but it does manage to achieve genuinely, universally good performance, especially at its new price, in gaming, lightweight production, and even in simultaneous live streaming and gaming workloads. We can strongly recommend the R5 2600 for a mid-range gaming PC build where the budget can't quite stretch to i7 or R7 territory. For most users, this CPU will be plenty, just like we once said about 5 generations ago now, that an i5 is, quote, enough for gamers. It is now the R5 is enough for most gamers. Where the R5 2600 holds a well-deserved award for Best Overall Value, the i9 9900K, even with its somewhat absurd pricing, does deserve to nab the award for Most Well-Rounded. To be fair, this one is still a toss-up between the 9900K and the 8700K, the latter of which received this award last year. To us, this category means one thing. This is a CPU that can play games at the highest frame rates and with the most consistent performance, but can also execute in common production applications with top-class performance. That would include Adobe Premiere, wherein we saw the 9900K nearly matching the performance of the $2,000 9980XE. It would include Photoshop, where the 9900K outperformed workstation competition, and that's because they like frequency, and it would include Blender, where the overclocked 9900K managed to complete frames in about 17 minutes for the monkey head render. That put it as on par with the 7900X, which is an impressive feat. Similarly, the 9900K also chart tops in our gaming benchmarks, where it managed some of the fastest turn completion times in Civilization 6, reducing the wait time between turns by noticeable margins. It held the highest marks in Far Cry 5 at 1080p, pushing 163 FPS average at 5.2 GHz and 156 FPS average stock. The 9900K further pushed nearly 300 FPS, both stock and overclocked, in F1 2018 at 1080p. Despite its price, and despite some of the controversy around it, the 9900K is genuinely very well-rounded. It's a good performer in all applications tested, but it's also expensive, and one would expect it would do well when it costs as much as it does. We'd like to see this come down in price still, and until the 9900K does come down a bit, the 8700K remains halfway holding on to this award, as it won it last year and still remains in the price category where the i9 9900K probably should be, which is about $350. Of course, to see any of these charts in more detail, check our previous reviews. For the best small business and hobbyist production CPU, we're giving it to the R7 2700. This category is for someone who might be ramping into professional workloads or who is just starting out as a small business in the field of content creation. The R7 2700 isn't the best gaming CPU. It does fine, but it's not something you buy for only gaming builds with ultra-high refresh or something like that. It is, however, an excellent value option that manages to perform better in production applications than its new $250 price tag would lead you to believe. It does well enough in games to enable gaming on the side while still maintaining a high-performance production throughput on the main side of the machine. In our Blender 2.79 benchmarks, we charted the R7 2700 as performing at 8700K levels when both were stock, completing our monkey head render in 26 minutes and our GN logo render in 32 minutes, versus 27 minutes and 33 minutes for the $80 more expensive 8700K. For tile-based rendering applications like Blender, the 2700 does exceptionally well. Overclocking to 4.2 GHz all-core got the 2700 to 23 minutes completion time for that same monkey head render, ranking it as just behind the stock 9900K, which is often over $500. That level of performance for the price is nearly unbeatable right now, allowing the 2700 to earn its award in this roundup. Ryzen isn't always the best for production workloads though, just as a reminder. For Adobe applications, desktop-class Intel CPUs tend to do better. We illustrated this recently in Photoshop, where the 9900K outperformed the 9980XE and 2990WX by somewhat significant margins. That's because Photoshop and Premiere, which saw similar performance, still favor raw frequency with a secondary requirement for threads. For someone who is a heavy Photoshop user, you live in Photoshop or maybe Premiere, we would instead lean towards one of the Intel desktop CPUs as a recommendation for more cost-friendly hobbyist production capabilities. This is for someone who is making some money from the work, but isn't doing it full-time just yet. For Blender, like rendering our GN logo intro animation, the R7 2700 is a powerful workhorse that pushes through frames even faster with an easy overclock, allowing it to match 2700X levels of performance. The 2700 also does well in its balance of gaming capabilities for the occasional session, while still enabling efficient throughput in thread-intensive applications. Primarily for the price of $250 and an easy 30-minute overclock session, the 2700 can stretch its legs at a more affordable price point than competing CPUs have been able to in the past. The next award is for Best Budget Gaming CPU. Last year we gave this to the Intel Pentium G4560, which allowed for reasonable baseline CPU performance at $50 to $80, depending on the time of the year that you bought the CPU, typically around $70 though. This year, the R3 2200G shakes things up a bit by integrating a reasonable IGP for some additional gaming horsepower. Although it's priced at $100 and therefore more expensive than our budget CPU category typically calls for, the trick is that there's no need to buy a GPU. It doesn't get much more budget than a $100 processor that includes both the CPU and GPU for the system. The 2200G includes a graphics processor that's strong enough for esports-style titles like Rocket League, Overwatch, and CSGO. Beyond that, you'll definitely want a dedicated GPU and CPU because performance of the R3 2200G suffers hard in other games. Total War Warhammer is a great example, where performance plummets to well below the performance of just about anything else. That said, if you're really tight on budget and want to save money on other components, the R3 2200G with an overclock will perform well in the aforementioned games while allowing cost savings elsewhere in the build. That's the real secret of this one. You can get a cheaper power supply, cheaper motherboard, and significantly smaller case that can all be combined with the 2200G for a low-cost gaming PC. This CPU is also a fun overclocker and not difficult to push beyond its stock settings, as our previous testing demonstrated. It's good when overclocking the IGP, and a good match for those lighter load titles that are burgeoning in popularity right now. Although we wanted to include Intel's Pentium G series as a good budget option when coupled with a discrete GPU, all Pentium G CPUs are currently at or above $100 given the 14nm shortage, which is ridiculous. This sad side effect means that it can't make the cut for our list, as the combined price with a GPU climbs to be too high to be worth it. Ultimately, if you can find a $50 to $60 CPU and couple it with a $90 video card, the combination is going to be better than a single R3 2200G. The R3 2200G comes in cheap though, and can fit in cases that other setups can't accommodate. The R5 2400G doesn't make the list, as its $160 price point isn't sensible, and you'd be far better off with a discrete GPU and CPU combination. And if you're curious, we're working on a 200GE review soon, so subscribe for that follow-up. To revive our Most Fun to Overclock award, Intel receives this one for its 8086K CPU launched this year. These are bin to 8700Ks that are nearly guaranteed to push far higher frequencies and lower voltages than their 8700K counterparts. Although we wouldn't recommend an 8086K for stock usage, there's really not much point when considering an 8700K instead. It's genuinely one of the most fun CPUs we've worked with for overclocking this year. A quick delid and some liquid metal later, and we got our first 8086K sample up to 5.35 GHz with 4000 MHz memory frequencies on just standard closed-loop liquid cooling. If you have some money to spend and are more interested in overclocking as a hobby or sport than in simply gaming or building, the 8086K offers a good avenue to dip into the overclocking world. The fact that headroom is often high means that the requirement to learn overclocking tricks will kick in sooner, posing an excellent learning opportunity for CPU overclocking. Although the 8086K was officially limited in quantity, it's still available through several online retailers at around $440. This brings us all the way around to the biggest disappointment category. Last year we gave this to Intel's Kaby Lake X CPUs, which were thereafter discontinued for the X299 platform. This year the biggest disappointment goes to the Intel i9-9980XE. This CPU aimed to revamp the 7980XE, an overclocking favorite of ours, with solder between the IHS and die to improve thermal transfer. Unfortunately, the gains can't be realized as the core-to-core deltas from concavity in the IHS are significant enough that we were able to overclock much higher on a delidded 7980XE. In our review of the 9980XE, we demonstrated thermal results with the 9980XE peaking at 104 for its hottest cores. Another chart from our review showed the highest to lowest core temperature delta of being about 40 degrees, which means our hottest 5 cores are limiting every other core in frequency. Although the 9980XE improved the situation over paste, for anyone overclocking this thing, it makes far more sense to buy a 7980XE, delid it, and apply liquid metal. The thermals are better, and the overclocking headroom is substantially improved by going that route with the previous CPU. Ultimately, we were able to push the soldered 9980XE to 5 GHz, but that was by using this. It's a radiator that can fit 18 140mm fans, or 4 200mm fans per side. Using something like this, yes, it overclocks well, but we can achieve similar clocks on a 7980XE with a liquid metal and a reasonable radiator that can fit in a case. The 9980XE gets credit for improving baseline stock performance over the 7980XE, something we demonstrated in benchmarks like Blender testing, but the limited OC headroom limits its target audience to a smaller user base. The only real user of the 9980XE is someone who needs both high frequency and high core count, already a small audience, and then further, only wants to use it stock. We were greatly disappointed in the soldered solution and the limited gains it provided, and so the 9980XE firmly earns its spot as the recipient of this year's Biggest Disappointment Award. And then the final award here, we'll do this one on camera. The final one is the Best Worst Trend Award, and the worst trend for this year, the best of the worst trends, goes to the motherboard manufacturers. So it's not exactly a CPU, but it is CPU adjacent. And this one goes to the motherboard manufacturers for an inability to decide on following a standardized specification, which is the one defined by the motherboard the motherboard manufacturer's primary partner, only partner, the CPU makers. So this we talked about with Intel, but it happens with AMD too. where there are violations of, for example, TDP, of turbo durations, happens on both AMD and Intel CPUs, in a way that makes testing difficult to standardize because it's always something new and sneaky in BIOS that you have to look out for that will throw off the results from spec, from the stock specification from the CPU maker. And that leads to results that are just, you end up having to really control a lot harder than should be, and then also start drawing new conclusions of, okay, this is how the product performs on motherboard A, this is how it performs on the way it should perform, and we end up just with a more difficult climate for newcomers to enter and try and understand the performance of different products, because they look at different reviewers who use different motherboards, different testing patterns and methodologies, and the results are just tremendously different in some cases. And all of this comes down to motherboard manufacturers to some degree, and that's because they find ways to skirt the spec and do things like enable, for example, a new version of MCE. Rather than going all-core to single-core turbo, they are now instead just bypassing the turbo duration limitations, which is another really good way to boost performance without being noticed by most people. So anyway, that's kind of the annoyance we've had this year, just working with motherboards and trying to make sure our tests from board to board remain representative of how the CPU is sold and marketed, rather than how the motherboard wants to re-specify the CPU to make the board look better, because ultimately that makes the CPU look better than it should out of the box. And that happens again with both CPU vendors. It's up to the motherboard makers at this point. So that was the most annoying trend for the year. But anyway, as we continue our awards shows for end of year, we will be recapping, of course, other devices. You can check our case recap on the YouTube channel already, or on the website if you prefer the written version. And keep an eye out for more CPU benchmarks, things like that. We have the 200GE coming up. It's a bit belated, but better to get it live at some point because it's an interesting processor. And other than that, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a mod mat like this one before the next round comes in, so that you can get one in this next batch coming up. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.